Masterclass is focused on the mind-body journey to wellness. And what that means is that we discuss weaving together mind-body medicine, flow science, and personalizing wellness. Today's topic it's two parts. Well, I guess really three parts, but there's two main parts. One is the relationship one has with themselves, and the second aspect is creating a sacred container or a sacred space. The third piece to that that follows behind those first two steps is prioritizing self-care. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. I'm curious about what brought you here to join us for this conversation today. Why are you here today?
Oh, that.
Can you say that again? I think it kind of glitched out.
Basically, get myself better from the event that happened to me last year.
Okay. Okay. Great. Well, I'm glad that you're here. I hope that some of this helps you.
Okay.
So there is this in our discussion today, we start with this relationship to self. The idea is that this is kind of where any change, any self-care behavior is going to start first with this, with the underlying phenomenon of this relationship that we have with ourselves. A lot of times we have a tendency to take this relationship for granted. Most people don't even really realize that there is a relationship to be had with ourselves. We tend to focus only on the relationship that we might have with other people or maybe our animals, but not so much on the relationship to the self. And in the same way that we will, in a healthy relationship, in the same way that we would turn toward other people, as in the same way that we would turn to the people that we care about in this dynamic of the relationship to self, we learn to turn toward ourselves. We learn to turn that sort of inner ear toward ourselves to recognize our needs and to develop self-compassion and practice self-care. Welcome, Sarah. I see you've just jumped in. Our conversation today is the main topic of this group is about weaving together mind-body medicine, flow science, and personalizing wellness. And we're about probably 5 or 6 weeks through this series, and now we've arrived at the topics of relationship to self and creating a sacred container. And the last piece that kind of follows on the back end of that is follow through, or also known as prioritizing self-care. But we have to first sort of look at this piece of the relationship that one has with themselves. Several years ago in my doctorate program, I did research on how people how do they restore or create lives of wellness, lives of well-being. And one of the sort of underlying factors that I discovered when I was interviewing people and analyzing the data was that there was a huge difference among the people who at some point realized that the relationship with themselves was important, that it was essential in their overall journey, and then those who did not. There were people that were interviewed who were involved in this study who never seemed to get this piece. And this was a study that was done organically, meaning there was no intervention done. It was just based on what people were already doing in their lives. And so, as I mentioned, sort of underneath, there was sort of this phenomenon. It almost reminded me of kind of a river that flowed underneath. There was two major concepts that had a huge impact on whether or not people were able to progress and rebuild their lives. Every single person that was in the study were people who had been brought to their knees in one fashion or another, either through divorce and breakup or through illness. So there was typically major loss that had occurred, and then long-term significant suffering that they had experienced, and then had at some point decided to really take control, for lack of a better term, really take control of their future and make some decisions on how to move forward. And so the two concepts were, one of them was the relationship to self, and the other one was flow, when people were experiencing this flow state that I've mentioned. So the relationship to self, it's very, it's a self-evident terminology. It is about the relationship one has with themselves, and what that means is people have different qualities of the relationship, different qualities of their relationship that they have, just like in life, where people have different relationship qualities with their partners. It showed up that same way in the research, where as people really developed this attitude of respect and care and sensitivity toward themselves, toward their needs and their preferences, towards their interests and towards their personal values. As they started to do that, they came to know themselves better, but they also increased the quality of that relationship. So this aspect of the relationship to self was key in people being able to progress forward. So some people found great difficulty in being able to do this, while others did not, while others were able to sort of lean in. One of the ways that occurred, one of the ways that the relationship to self was able to develop, was as people found their way into a practice that resonated with them or that spoke to them in some way. Usually, it was specifically mind-body practices that seemed to cultivate this experience of self-compassion, self-awareness, where people became involved more, or experienced sort of a closer relationship with themselves. Some of those practices included yoga was a big practice, where people experienced this sense of feeling in the practice itself. It was often quite challenging, but at the same time there was this sense of sort of this sense of this witness self that that came forth in the practice. There were other practices that people did as well, and that included martial arts training, Tai Chi, dance, and even regular practices of of prayer and meditation. So these mind-body practices were essential in helping people sort of develop that sense of coming home to themselves or showing up for themselves. Some people also report that going to the gym is kind of an experience where, as they've developed a routine, this has, a sense of self-respect and self-care has resulted as a result of maintaining the commitment to taking care of one's body physically. And so when we think about mind-body medicine, it has had a similar effect. Welcome, Josh. I'm glad you jumped in.
I can't see no one. I was like, is this an audio or something? Because I don't see no one. It's glitching.
Yes, I think that sometimes that happens. My app was kind of frozen a little bit ago, but the show must go on. so we just move with it. Our topic right now is on, it's about the relationship to self and creating essentially a sacred space for that and prioritizing self-care. This concept of creating sacred space, I actually have to credit it to a nonprofit organization that I used to work with called Shakti Rising. And that was an organization that provided transformational recovery services to women and helps women develop leadership skills. And it was in that program, I was a volunteer for the program. It was during that time that this concept of self-container or sacred container was introduced to me. And since then, I've really just sort of adopted that into my lifestyle and my way of thinking. And so this other aspect of sacred container is where we create intentional space for something to happen. And this particular piece around the relationship to self, we're creating intentional space to come to ourselves, to cultivate this space where we come to understand ourselves better. Sometimes it's difficult to speak about what happens, what it is that's occurring, but as a person regularly comes to a daily practice of meditation or yoga or dance, whatever their thing is, as a person comes to this daily practice, there is kind of a sense of, I think of it as sort of as like a thickened container, almost like an armor or a type of protection that forms around the person. And that container, essentially what it is it's filled with the energy of confidence and self-respect and self-care. It's filled with knowing that you're going to prioritize meeting your own needs first. A lot of times we have a tendency to focus on meeting other people to meet our needs. Welcome, Anna. Our conversation is about the relationship to self right now. So that's what you just jumped in on is that conversation. And as we sort of, just like in an intimate relationship, right? A healthy relationship is healthy because the partners turn to each other. If one makes a gesture towards wanting something or needing something, the partner turns toward them in a receptive gesture to look, to receive, to see, like, what is it that you need? How can I respond? So that same idea is the idea that is offered here in terms of this relationship to self. Now, typically the relationship we have with ourself very much is mirrored in the relationship we have with other people. So if one has a relationship of denying themselves, or they have a relationship of sort of abandoning themselves, meaning a person doesn't show up for themselves. They may do that in their relationships with other people. And sometimes, people may find that a lot of this there's definitely a connection to our attachment styles. Whether we feel solid and secure within ourselves because we had caregivers that really showed up for us and met our needs, or if we're anxious because they didn't, and we were always clamoring to try to get our needs met, or they didn't, and we learned how to not need anybody and instead sort of go elsewhere. So coming back to this idea of the relationship to self, this was a discovery that was found in my research on how it is that people create lives of well-being, and this undercurrent in the relationship, the undercurrent in the relationship that I found, in the data, was about this relationship that people had with themselves. People learned to value themselves, and they learned to turn toward themselves as a relationship in this wellness journey, and that in itself is part of what helped propel them forward in their journey of well-being. So this discussion, by the way, is based on research that it's built on research that has been conducted by other people, but particularly sort of this combination of mind-body medicine, flow science, and personalizing wellness. This is from the research I did when I was in my doctorate program. So welcome, Kristen. So I'd like to open the room up just for a moment and see when you think about this idea of relationship to self, think about the relationship to yourself, what comes to mind? Would you be willing to share a little bit? Yes, Anna, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm like so grateful and so happy that I found this room, because this is exactly kind of like where I have some room for improvement. Because I struggle with self-love. I'm kind of codependent and also perfectionist. So I'm a people pleaser. So for me, it's very easy to give empathy and love and help to people around me. I kind of like notice the things that they need without them even noticing that themselves. Like, for example, I notice that person needs to go to the washroom just by their body language, or for example, that they are hungry, or they probably want to drink something and stuff like that, even before they kind of like voice that. So yeah, and I have trouble with like giving that love to myself and noticing things that I need and giving those things to myself. And exactly as you mentioned, it's like in healthy relationship, people turned towards each other, and they respond to each other's needs. And with yourself, having a healthy relationship with yourself, it's basically like being attuned and responding to your own needs instead of ignoring them. And yeah, I kind of like struggle with that and with self-love. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that, Anna. I think this is very common, to be more attuned to other people's needs versus our own. And it starts with a bit of a reorientation, reorienting our attention to ourselves in that way. It can feel really foreign at first because we may have developed incredible skills um, very intuitive skills for being able to recognize other people's needs. But this reorientation can be supported through mindfulness-based type of activities that bring our attention to ourselves in a way that is non-judgmental. But also progressive, meaning we progress through a series of we progress through a series of activities or behaviors through the activity. Sometimes, I know that meditation is often recommended as a stress-reducing skill, or for people to, sort of really develop this relationship with reality in a different way. But sometimes that's the harder place to start first. As far as my learning goes, is that meditation, like yoga, for instance, was initially developed as a way to prepare the body for meditation, to prepare the body and mind for meditation. That it's rare, or it takes a very disciplined person to actually be ready. Not disciplined, that's the wrong word. It takes a very skilled person with a lot of experience to be able to sit down straight into a meditation. That's very, very difficult. And so to put the body in motion first, it helps to sort of get I think of it as the wigglies. It helps to get all the wigglies out of our bodies. It helps to, we're having all of these positive chemicals that are released into our bloodstream when we go into a physical practice, as like, for instance, with the yoga practice. If I go into a yoga practice, say it's 20 or 45 minutes, I'm in that practice, and what that practice is doing is focusing my attention during that time. Now, maybe while I'm doing some of the poses, my attention might come to, sort of how my legs shake, or the challenges of my balance, or the discomfort of my body. But if we're working typically under an instructor, either in video or in live person, typically that instructor is guiding us to be with what is happening, not to judge it, not to fear it, and also to really listen to our bodies. And as we are doing this, we sort of get into like this third place within ourselves, where it's almost like the small voice, or the ego voice, sort of fades away, and instead we have found ourselves in this sort of zone. Now, it takes effort. It takes, we kind of go through this struggle phase before we can get there. But for those people who are willing to like stick it through the struggle phase, they release into this amazing zone where they feel connected and just really vital and alive. And even though it still might be challenging, there's a new edge that's present. And that edge feels amazing. And as we do that, when we come into these places, we've really come into what is our optimal zone at that time and at that place for ourselves. You can think of it as your peak zone for you. And this changes the more that we engage in a practice or an activity. This zone, it still is kind of a place that we will enter into within ourselves. It's the result of changing the brain wave state that we're in. And as we get into that altered, that brainwave state, it's called theta. As we get into that brainwave state, it's like we're altered. We're in a higher state of our own consciousness. When we get into that place, we become aware of our truth. Now, the truth I'm speaking about here is like, I think of it as like our potential truth, our divine truth, the truth of who we are as a human being. And in those moments, we can become really, really clear on what actually matters and what doesn't. So it's almost like it's like a journey getting to these inward places. But it's like I kind of think of it as like a journey into an inward temple. And so we don't get to just get in there. We do have to work for it. But fortunately, there are these practices that can get us there. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning when I talked about sort of progressive steps that get us into something. And that's what I mean. So it's like we do have to work for it. But once we get in, we've landed in this really sort of divine inner temple where it just becomes what really matters becomes very clear. Now, this place that we've just arrived at, that is sort of that zone of optimal experience, the temple, so to speak. Now, there is this idea, I think I mentioned this before you got on the call, Anna, of creating a sacred container. And as I don't know if I mentioned this when you were still here or not, this idea of sacred container is something I picked up from an organization I used to do volunteer work with. And that organization is named Shakti Rising. But they used to teach this concept of the sacred container. Now, I'm using it a little bit differently here than they did for us, but I think generally it kind of means the same. Now, so this idea of the sacred container is where we intentionally create space for something to happen. That means that we essentially, like, the way that looks like for me in my life is I will come up to my bedroom in the morning after I've kind of done some of my early morning routine. I'll come up to my bedroom, turn on music, and dance for anywhere between 10, 15, or 30 minutes. And that dance is kind of like my yoga practice. That's the thing that sort of gets me into this higher state, this higher consciousness. And it's there where I sort of get my daily cup of tapping into my true presence. So the sacred container, a lot of times people, we might struggle with it because because we haven't made space for it ever before, so there's no space for it, and so it takes some effort to make space for it, and so that we have a space to come to it. It doesn't have to be something that's in your home necessarily, although I do think it makes it a little more accessible if your sacred container, if your practice is something that you do at home. But before this, a lot of people, their sacred container essentially is when they go to their class. They go to their yoga class, or they go to their Tai Chi class. That act in itself of walking into this room that somebody else prepared is they're walking into that container. And they know the moment that they walk into that room that they are going to have a different kind of experience than they do in their day-to-day, like typically in their day. And so that idea is what I'm offering in you to do also in your personal life. But ultimately, the idea is we start with whatever works first. And so if going to a place where somebody else is creating the container and you walk into it, if that's what you need, that's where you start, right? Like sometimes that's what we need is for somebody else to have created the container and then we walk into it. That's a type of holding. Maybe we don't know how to create that for ourselves yet. Or maybe we've got 6 kids at home and it's very difficult to be able to have that kind of stillness and quietness for ourselves. So sort of creating that container is something that, at this point, the only thing we actually do is make the time to do it. That's where our act of creating the container is. It's where I tell myself, okay, every day, at 7 o'clock, I get in my car and I drive to the studio, so that by 7:30, I have entered into that sacred space. And for the next hour, I am in this sacred space for myself. Now, welcome, Rachel. I see you've popped in. It's good to see you. So we establish the container by that one act of making that decision and then showing up for it. Now, if we are in a place where we can we can do this at home, that has its own complexities, but I do think most of us make it more difficult than it has to be. With our own thoughts about it, maybe our indecision or whatever, but creating sacred container at home begins with a decision, and it begins with a time. And we can start with 5 minutes, we can start with 30 minutes, we can start with an hour. But to have that clear goal of how long I'm going to be in this space with myself is essential. So Rachel, our conversation today is about developing a relationship with ourselves, and how to do that. One way to do that is through this aspect of creating sacred space for ourselves. So these two kind of go, they kind of go hand in hand in recognizing the importance of this container for yourself, that you need it so that you can show up for yourself. Now, a lot of times the relationship to self is it's trackable by the agreements we keep with ourselves. So that's the number one way that we can, if we want to look at, like, it's always good to start first with self-evaluation. And remember, self-evaluation does not mean self-judgment or self-criticism. It only means looking at what is. And when we do that, when we can look at what is as objectively as possible, that can give us the information that we need. So sometimes the challenge for people is like detaching ourselves from interpretation or judgment. Those two things, judgment and interpretation, are detrimental at this point. And so it's good to just kind of leave them aside. So coming back to this idea of self-evaluation, we're just looking at the quality of the relationship we have with ourselves. And so when we look at that, so we can ask ourselves this question: do I keep the agreements that I make with myself? So just think about the things that that you've said to yourself, I want to do this. This is important to me. And how well have you done with keeping those agreements to yourself? Have you followed through? Now, this is the part where it's really important that we don't self-critique or self-judge, but that we just look at it. We're just like, oh, nope. Nope, I did not. I said I was going to go to yoga every day, or 3 times a week. That's a little more reasonable. I said I was going to go to yoga 3 times a week, either upstairs in my bedroom or at a studio, but I did not do that. Okay. Noted. Okay, anything else? Well, I really want to have a nighttime routine of putting oil on my body and doing um, a massage practice, for a self-massage practice for myself. I really want to do that. Or I've really wanted to do that. Okay. Have you done that? Yeah, I have actually. For how long? Probably about the last 10 or 15 years. Oh, okay. So you've done that. You've really kept this agreement with yourself. Yeah, I have. Okay, that's good. That's good. That's a notch there. Okay, what else? What else do we need to consider here? So this is how, we just have this conversation with ourselves. Did I keep my agreement? Yes or no? No. How long have I been struggling with this? 5 years. Okay, so for 5 years I've not been keeping my agreement. Okay. And it's not always necessary, I don't believe anyway, I don't think it's always necessary to dig into the whys. It's at some point it's just enough. If we're ready, we can make the decision to do something different. Am I ready today? Am I ready now to implement a regular practice for myself? I am. Okay, is there anything that's in my way? What are the barriers that could stop me? And I list those out. A barrier could be not having clean clothes, not knowing where to go, and not having a practice. Okay, so I have to figure those 3 out, plan ahead. So this, coming back to this idea again of the relationship to self, it can be so easily measured by those agreements, the agreements we keep with ourselves, or the ones we don't. One thing we do need to be careful of is that we don't give ourselves so many agreements that we can't keep track of them. So having no more than 3 agreements is a good idea to start with. I would recommend 1 if this is brand new to you. You start with just 1 agreement to keep with yourself. And there's a popular idea that's popping up, it's out there today in pop media, which is this idea of what gets measured, what gets tracked, happens, essentially. Like what we keep track of, we do. We will follow through on it. And so I don't think it's necessary to be super, really you don't have to be super on top of it, but enough to begin to get the wheels rolling. So starting with just 1 and having no more than 3 agreements that we keep with ourselves. So the relationship to self, again, we look at, so the relationship itself is, the quality, it can be positive and generative and good. Basically, it can be nourishing, or it cannot be, right? If it can be on the other side of the spectrum, where it sort of takes, where there is no relationship to self, where other people, our whole life is sort of dictated by what other people want or what they need. So maybe there's a complete absence of this relationship. So the relationship to self, again, is absolutely key. It's a key factor in this overall journey of well-being. I mentioned a while ago about reorienting ourselves. So a person can orient themselves to pay attention to what other people need and what they want, but it takes time to orient that attention towards towards ourselves. Now, there's 4 areas to keep in mind here. In terms of like, what am I talking about? What do I orient to? What matters here? One of those things is your needs. So you can, what do you need? Like, what do you need? What do you need emotionally? What do you need mentally? What do you need physically? What do you need spiritually? So we start with that, so need is really important. What do you need? So I spoke about agreements a minute ago. As you're considering your agreements, all of this information that we're about to talk about, this information should be considered alongside this idea of what agreements to make with yourself. So we have your needs, right? What do I need physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually? It's important that each of those aspects are considered. And next we ask ourselves, well, what am I interested in? What are my interests? Now, what I really like about this is and actually this is what engages us in the world. This is what engages us in our life. So what are my interests? What am I curious about? What gets my attention? Right? So for me, I'm really curious about the soil and gardening. So if there's something going on around permaculture or natural organic gardening or soil health, that gets my attention. I love it. So what are your interests? You think about what your interests are. And you might have 25 of them, and that's okay. The work here is to identify what those interests are. Okay. So we looked at what your needs are. Now we sort of discuss this piece about your interests. Now the third one is your preferences. Preferences and interests are not the same thing. Here's an example. In my research, I had some people who had a preference when they were working out, like when they started training or working out, they had a preference for being in an environment where people were conscientious, where there was sort of this sense of people working on themselves versus just kind of going to a place where people are mindlessly working out and watching TV. And so one of the participants in my study was really, really clear that she can't go to a gym and work out if there's 25 TVs on the wall. Because to her, that represented a place to check out instead of a place to check in. And she wanted wherever she went to go train her body or work out her body, she wanted it to be an environment that encouraged people to go in instead of check out. So that's an example of a preference. Preference is like, what do you prefer? Some people prefer quiet environments that are sort of like very peaceful. Some people really prefer very outgoing, high energy kind of places. Okay, so we've talked about your needs, recognizing your needs, and the 4 aspects associated with your needs. Then we talked about your interests. Then we talked about preferences. Now the final piece here in this like relationship to self dynamic is that we must consider your values. And by that, I mean, what matters to you? What's important to you? So values are anything that matters to you. That's important. Now, it is important to consider this, when you think about the relationship to yourself, you think about the relationship to yourself, what values do you have? What's important to you? And I'll give you an example for me. One of my values that ties to my relationship with myself is I value being in relationship with other emotionally healthy people. I have lots of people in my life that are not emotionally healthy. Through sometimes through professional dynamics, sometimes through family dynamics, through extended family. Like we've all got like loads of people around us that are, we just get them. We just get people in our life that we wouldn't necessarily choose, right? That's just life. I think that's the way sort of the Creator likes to mix us all up together. But in terms of values, I do get to make a choice on who is going to be in my closest circles. And so one of my values is those people that are closest to me, they're people who care about me, they care about themselves, and that they treat people with care. So another value can be valuing, like I value like environmental stuff. I value nature. And so when I think about this relationship to myself, peace, sometimes some of the things that I'm doing, some of the activities that I do, I'm deliberately putting myself into nature because nature is important to me for my well-being. So in this like coming to know, so one of the great teachings that we've heard throughout time, we used to hear it, Aristotle said it, I believe Jesus Christ said it. There's been multiple throughout time. We've heard this idea of know thyself. Know thyself. Like this is a critical piece in our well-being, is to know thyself. And beginning with considering these questions at depth can be a great way to begin this journey. So I've shared a lot with just that last little segment, and I'd like to open the floor up to any questions or comments. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yeah, Kristen. I cannot hear you, so you might still be muted.
I'm sorry. I had to work all of a sudden. I came into the room and realized that I was late for work, so I had to leave the room, and I'm still working, but I thought I would just catch you and tell you why I had to leave. So,
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate
and
that.
have a good evening.
Thank you. All right. Anybody else? Anna or Vineet, you were here for that little section. Do either of you have a comment or a question? Okay. So let's see. So just in kind of beginning to wrap this up a little bit, today's conversation has been about the relationship to self, our relationship to ourselves, learning to recognize that turning toward ourselves is a key aspect in our journey of well-being, having a deliberate relationship with ourselves. And then we moved on into just this latest piece that I shared was about this aspect of orienting towards ourselves. A lot of times people talk about being overly identified with what other people want or need. And so how do we begin to shift that? I think it is a great skill set. It's a great ability to be able to recognize what other people need and what they want. I think that's a great quality to have. Now, if it's like to a point to where we ourselves don't have any needs because they're not recognized, and so we can never meet them, that's when it gets a little top-sided. It gets a little heavy on one side. So it gets imbalanced, right? So it's not that we want to toss it out the window that we can be responsive to other people's needs, because that's important in relationship building. But what we do want to make sure is that that we ourselves aren't completely absent from that equation. We're not here to be a servant to someone else, right? We're here to be in relationship with other people. And so there's that balance between recognizing and being able to receive and notice other people, but then also being able to turn that vision inward to recognize what it is we need. And so those last 4 pieces that I spoke about are one way that we begin to shift that orientation into ourselves. We recognize what our needs are. And I'm saying this for you, Becca, because I know you just jumped in. But the needs are, needs include recognizing our emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual needs. And then moving into being able to identify our preferences and our interests, what we're interested in. And then finally becoming cognizant of what our values are. As we begin to, as we get familiar, like we spend the time, we sit down with our books, we sit down with our journal, we write this stuff out. As you do that, you're going to become more self-aware, and you'll become more anchored in yourself in terms of understanding how to fulfill your needs, how to direct your life in a way so that you're curious about it, so you're excited about it. So this early work, or this work that we do, it's not it's not useless. Sometimes people underestimate or they undervalue how important this self-work is. But it's really critical in this aspect of being able to have a healthy relationship with ourselves. The last thing I spoke about was this idea of creating a sacred container. And creating or going into a sacred container. Like I said, if you can't create one for yourself for whatever reason, you go to a space where somebody has created it for you, like a yoga class or a dance class. But you go to a place where somebody has created intentional space to hold you and your classmates, maybe even an Aikido class. And this sacred holding, this container, in that you are, there are, and I don't have time to open this back up, but that's where we create those experiences so that we enter into that optimal state inside of ourselves. And when we access that optimal state, that is where we get really clear about what really matters and what doesn't. What's a waste of our energy that we can drop, whether that's mental or physical or emotional, or what really matters to us. And getting clear like that is really essential for well-being, for happiness, and just feeling like we're living the life that we were intended to live, the life that we're here to live. So it is time. Yes, Anna, go ahead.
So I just wanted to reiterate, you were talking about needs, preferences, interests, and what's the 4th one?
Values.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, everybody. Well, we're at the top of the hour now, so it's time for me to close this up. Thank you for being here, and thanks for being a part of the conversation. All right, thank you. I'm going to close the room out now. Bye, everybody.